Hello everyone and welcome to another casual review. Today I'm talking about Final Fantasy III Pixel Remaster. I like to think of Final Fantasy III more as a sequel to the first Final Fantasy rather than the second Final Fantasy. Sure, it takes some elements out of both of these games, but it just feels a lot more in line with the first Final Fantasy in that all of our characters are blank slates once again. Yes, these characters do talk, but it often does not say which of these characters is doing the talking. Rather, these four characters are more thought about as a single entity. You also have a lot of accountability and choice in terms of these characters' names and what kind of abilities these characters have. Instead of classes, these characters gain their abilities through a new concept called jobs. And jobs are basically classes, but a lot more fluid in that you are able to easily change between these different jobs. We're of course quickly labeled at the beginning of the game the Warriors of Light, and they bring back the themes of these crystals that are corrupted and need to be restored once more throughout the land. Of course, we have our angry antagonist named Xande, I think that's how you pronounce it. Anyway, he's opening up these chasms in the world and releasing a bunch of monsters into the world, and so we need to go stop him. As far as antagonists go, I actually thought the Emperor was a lot cooler of an antagonist than Xande. I don't know, I feel like we don't really get to see Xande that much or hear about him that much. As far as overall stories go, Final Fantasy II definitely is superior in this regard. And coming fresh off the heels of Final Fantasy II, I actually found myself at the beginning of this game missing the Final Fantasy II leveling systems, in that the more you use a certain spell or weapon, the more proficient you get with it. And so I was a little bummed when I first started playing this game, because I really liked the second game's way of leveling up, because it felt like every encounter I was improving in some way. But then I did quickly realize, you know what, they still kind of do have the Final Fantasy II leveling system. However, it is a lot more simplified in terms of your job level, whereas the more you are battling using a certain job, the more proficient your character will be with that job. I wouldn't get too hung up on your job level though. I do feel like this game intends you to fluctuate your jobs quite frequently depending on the scenario that you're in. You have a ton of different jobs available to you at the end of the game. At the beginning, you start out with maybe like 5 or 6 different jobs. Then as you purify these crystals, you slowly unlock more and more jobs. When most Final Fantasy fans think of Final Fantasy III, they think of the job system, and the job system is often revered. However, I would say that the job system is actually pretty flawed in terms of most modern RPG games and how they handle the jobs, because I feel like at least half of these jobs that are available to you are very gimmicky and simplified, and occasionally just not good at all, often overshadowed by other jobs. For instance, for the majority of the game, I had a black mage and a white mage, and the geomancer and the bard and subsequent classes that came after it just actually weren't that fleshed out compared to these basic jobs that I had at the beginning of the game. Now, granted, eventually, like by the end of the game, you do get access to some really powerful jobs that I think you are kind of meant to switch over. By the end of the game, I had a ninja, I had a black belt, I think I had a sage. Sages are kind of like these all-in-one mages that can cast like any kind of spell, including summons. We'll get into that in a second. And then I had a devout, which is basically like a more powerful white mage. I did think it was cool that a lot of these jobs had like an extra ability that they could utilize, especially like the melee characters, because it feels like in the past 2 Final Fantasy games, my melee characters are just doing attack, 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 attack. Whereas now, like now that I have a black belt, my black belt can do like this kick move where it's basically just like an AoE physical attack, or like my ninja can throw items which do a ton of damage. Dragoons, of course, can like leap up in the air, then land the next turn, and so there is a certain amount of strategy that is available to me now that weren't in Final Fantasy 1 and 2, at least for my melee characters. There's also a ton of different mage options for me, although most of them aren't that good. Like the Geomancer that I mentioned can basically just use like random spells, and depending on like the terrain you're in is what kind of spell that Geomancer will cast. Bards, I mean, you kind of, if you've ever played like a fantasy game like this before, you kind of understand what bards do, but their effects, as far as I could tell, weren't that powerful enough to warrant having a bard over something like a white mage. But the most interesting job, in my opinion, as far as spellcasters go, is they have introduced summons, and summons have been a big part of the Final Fantasy series for a very long time, and so I was excited to have access to the Evoker class so early on in the game. However, most of the early level summons just aren't really that great compared to the variety that the Black Mage has in terms of spells, and so I quickly reverted back to the Black Mage. I didn't really start utilizing the summons until really late in the game when I had access to the Sage job that was also able to cast these summons. And so visually these summons are really exciting, however they aren't really that accessible or at least useful until way late in the game. They also have some like side bosses that you can go and take on, and if you do defeat them, then you have access to their powerful summons, which is a cool staple of Final Fantasy. The cap level for these job levels is 99, and I was able to get my black belt up to a level 99. As far as benefits of capping out your character, at least in this version, I haven't been able to notice any benefits other than increased stats. And so I really think that you are totally able to fluctuate in terms of like your jobs and experiment depending on the type of situation that you're in. I do really think that they have buffed up white mages in terms of giving them a decent amount of offensive abilities, buffs, heals, and then you can also have access to staffs that allow you to cast certain spells. And so, at least from what I could tell, there's very little reason to not have a white mage in your party at all times. As far as dungeons go, compared to Final Fantasy II, I felt like they were so much more manageable. They are fairly linear. Yes, there are a ton of hidden passageways, but the hidden passageways are fairly obvious, at least in this Pixel Remaster version where you can just pull up the map and see where there's little cracks in the walls. And so yeah, they're all over the place, but you can totally tell where you're supposed to go. As far as the dungeon layouts go, they're pretty linear and shorter, a lot shorter than Final Fantasy II. In Final Fantasy II, some of these dungeons were commitments. That is not necessarily the case in here, aside from the very last dungeon in the game, which we'll talk about in a second. As far as the enemy combat goes, I feel like they dropped down the encounter rate, so I could actually move around in the dungeon without triggering an actual combat scenario, which is definitely an upgrade from Final Fantasy II. I feel like as far as enemies go, I could really utilize the auto battle a lot better than in Final Fantasy II. It had a good balance of basic fodder enemies that I could just auto battle my way through, and then at the end of most dungeons, there is an actually interesting boss that I had to take down, and I couldn't auto battle my way through most of these bosses at the end of each dungeon. I actually had to like think my way through this combat scenario. Occasionally, I would even have to like change up my jobs to accommodate to how this boss fights, which I think is a really good balance of leveling up and grinding through the basic stuff, but actually having to use my brain for some special enemies. But I did mention an exception here, and Final Fantasy III's infamous Crystal Tower is like the end level dungeon, and it can be fairly difficult to navigate through this Crystal Tower alongside this extra dungeon that you have to access after you beat the Crystal Tower, and so it is quite the hurdle at the end of the game. You really have to be prepared before you try to tackle this end level challenge. That being said, I really do enjoy the amount of power that I feel contrasting the beginning of this game to the very end of this game, where I have unlocked all these super powerful jobs, I've gotten all these super powerful weapons. You have access to go like unlock these powerful weapons and spells and everything like that if you engage in some of the side content, and I did, and so I really liked the feeling of that growth. That's really what I'm looking for in an RPG, is going from this rags to riches, and really not just getting upgraded statistically, but also in terms of my knowledge of how the game functions. Formations have made a return from Final Fantasy II. Basically, you can have guys in the front line or the back line. Guys in the back line won't do as much damage for like melee attacks, for instance, instance, but their spells are unaffected. To counter this, though, occasionally you'll have a small chance of getting ambushed, where basically now the formations are reversed, and so your mages that are supposed to be in the back line are in the front line now, and so it adds maybe a little bit of a twist to the basic random encounters, but overall didn't affect my gameplay too much. You do have companions that follow you, unlike Final Fantasy II, where they are actually the fourth party member in your group. They just follow you around in the overworld. I'm told that they will occasionally affect combat, however, that has never happened to me in this game, and so maybe the Pixel Remaster takes away that ability, or maybe statistically the chance of your companion helping you out is so low that I never encountered it. I do like this idea a lot better than how Final Fantasy II tackled it, where I can still have my 4 party members, but I could still have a companion that like affects the story and I can interact with in some capacity. In terms of interacting with the world, you will occasionally need to cast some potentially harmful spells on yourself. For instance, you will need to turn your party into frogs in order to dive underwater, or in order to interact with these tiny little areas, you will need to occasionally cast mini on your party. This can add some restrictions on its own, and this is where being able to switch up your jobs on the fly comes in handy, because if you are mini, then you can still cast spells. So maybe you'll want to turn your warrior and your monk back into like mages so that they can actually be useful in these mini fights. One thing that's really beneficial about constantly switching up our jobs, even though we don't necessarily want to, is this game has a feature where it like automatically optimizes the best possible gear that your character could be wearing. Do I 100% agree sometimes with these optimizations? No, not necessarily, but if I'm just switching my character on the fly back and forth, it is nice that I don't have to worry about choosing the best gear for them as well. And you might need it, because in terms of enemies hitting your characters, I feel like they hit a lot harder than they did in Final Fantasy 1 and 2. And again, this is another reason why I think you need a dedicated white mage, is because like most of these, at least like end level enemies that you're going to encounter, can take down even your beefiest character in about 2 hits, unless you've, I don't know, extremely over leveled these characters. And so your healer is actually usually going to have to be like a dedicated healer, especially endgame. Visually, I do think that these enemies are a little more, I don't know if I'd use the word cartoony, but their features are definitely more exaggerated. The eyes are more big, the arms and the muscles are more detailed, and I think they've exaggerated these features to kind of give these enemies a little more character and personality. Most of them don't look as cool as they did in Final Fantasy 1 and 2, but I can definitely get more personality out of them when I do see their sprites. Another thing that I've noticed is they've taken out any kind of tents or cottages. These are items that you could use on the overworld in order to heal up your character's health and mana, and you would think that you would be missing them, especially because these enemies are hitting you a lot harder. However, I feel like they kind of anticipated this, because there are many locations around dungeons and the overworld where you can interact with this water in order to automatically heal yourself. So you don't need to worry about stocking up on these items, because you can just find these springs of water that will automatically heal you, which is very nice. With that item management, they've also introduced the concept of fat chocobos, which is a very cute, sleepy, flat chocobo that you can store items in its stomach. I think it's similar to like the original Pokemon games where you have to store items into your PC because you can only hold so many. In the Pixel Remaster version, you can basically hold as many items as you want. At least I never hit the cap of items that I could hold, and so that essentially makes the fat chocobos useless, but I'm glad that they included them, if anything, for the entertainment of a fat, sleepy chocobo. This game also appears, to me at least, to be the introduction of Moogles, a common creature staple that is in Final Fantasy. They are these white little, I don't know if you'd call them bears with bat wings. There might have been some in Final Fantasy 2, however, I don't recall ever encountering one of these creatures in that game. While exploring, you can potentially interact with these pianos, and the more you play on these newly discovered pianos, the better you get with these pianos. I don't think this does anything gameplay-wise, aside from if you're playing a version of this game on a system with achievements, there's probably like an achievement attached to these, like play all of the pianos in the inns. But eventually you do get like better with these pianos, and like the NPCs around the inn will do little jigs and stuff like that. So visually it's pretty fun to just, I mean, quickly pop over to a new town's inn and play its piano. In terms of navigation, I was incredibly surprised how early they give you the airship. However, I quickly learned that the airship in this game cannot navigate over mountains like it could in Final Fantasy 1 and 2. Not to mention, it's like right when you get that airship at the beginning of the game, it does get destroyed. That's not to say that you don't get an airship pretty soon afterwards, but in terms of navigation, your airship is almost like modular, where it slowly gets more upgrades that unlock more parts of the map. So you can get it's more like a boat than an airship, and then it turns into an airship, and then it gets the ability to submerge underwater, and then you get like this giant airship that basically has vendors and a bed all attached to that, and it can jump over small parts of the mountain. And so the world slowly gets more and more unveiled to you as you play through it. But the ultimate reveal, at least in my opinion, the as far as like the world goes in Final Fantasy 3, you're playing on this area, this map that you think is the entire world, but then you fly off that little island, and then you realize, like, no, I was just playing on a tiny little island. There's this huge other world to explore. So it's just a cool moment when you think that you've uncovered basically everything in this area, that only to realize that there's just so much more for you to do. That's not to say that this is an incredibly huge game, especially if you're playing with all the quality of life features that are included in the Pixel Remaster and you are following through a walkthrough. It did take me a little bit longer than Final Fantasy 1, but I was able to complete it shorter than Final Fantasy 2 with just under 10 hours of playtime for this one. Did I 100% get all the pianos and all the gear and max out my levels and everything? No, but I was able to beat the last boss with only 2 tries, and not really any requirements to go back and grind before I tackled most challenges. At worst, I did try to tackle Odin. He would wipe out my party, so I just came back to Odin later. It's just this optional side boss that you can encounter in order to unlock his summon. But yeah, other than that though, I didn't really have a need to like go and grind or anything. I think it's a good length for a nice short little RPG, and I actually had a really fun time playing this one. I'm going to rate this one a 4 out of 5. It is 1 point higher than Final Fantasy 1 and 2, and that wraps up the NES trilogy, actually. Tune in for the next Final Fantasy video where we tackle Final Fantasy IV, the first game of the Super Nintendo trilogy, and we can tag along with Cecil the Dark Knight and his adventure. Well guys, that's it for me. Let me know if you have any questions or comments about Final Fantasy III Pixel Remaster, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later. Bye!